Hey there, it's Melissa Brunetti, and welcome to the Mind Your Own Karma podcast.
Hey there, Karma crew. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Mind Your Own Karma, the Adoption Chronicles. Today, I have Brad Miele on the show. He is a Gen X adoptee from the baby scoop era who grew up in New Jersey in the 70s and 80s. His adopters were wealthy, and his experience as a young child was great. He went on to experience many negative life events as a result of unresolved maternal separation trauma. And it wasn't until 10 years ago that he connected the dots and started coming out of the fog. He started advocating for adoptee voices on Twitter during the pandemic and switched to TikTok in late 2023, where he educates about adoption abolition, advocates for safe external care for children in need, and cautions influencers about the dangers of childhood exploitation on social media, especially when their children have already experienced maternal separation trauma. Here is my interview with Brad Miele. So we are welcoming Brad Miele to the show today. Hi, Brad.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So I saw you on TikTok, and so you have kind of a different view on things than anyone else I've had on the show. So I'm happy that you decided to come on today and kind of discuss those things. But let's start first kind of with your story, and if you can share
Sure.
a little bit about your adoption journey and what you knew, why you were put up for adoption.
Yeah, sure. So, and I think it's important to note that, like, as I tell the story, there's a big part of it that I've only learned recently, right? So sometimes it gets a little confusing. You're describing events that happened before you knew a thing. So I just want to, if there's any confusion in the wording, please ask me to clarify. But yeah, I was adopted as a baby scoop infant adoptee from an agency in 1968, and I was adopted in Yonkers, New York. And I was adopted by a couple who lived in New Jersey, a young lawyer and his wife. My adoptive mother was before they married, she was a nurse, a home health nurse. And then after they married, she was a stay-at-home mother. And they lived in New Jersey. They were at the tail end of a long fertility struggle. And they had turned to an agency adoption, an agency that still exists today. And so I was adopted, from there. I grew up in a town called Far Hills, New Jersey. Everyone likes to say Fart Hills, especially my children when I talk about it. And we all get a good laugh. But yeah, it's, to be timely, it's right next to Bedminster. So, pretty much right in Donald Trump's backyard, or it wasn't his backyard when I was growing up there. It became his backyard. But so, yeah, I grew up in that area of New Jersey. It was a, fairly wealthy area. My father was upper middle class for the time, for I think for the 80s. And so I went to I played hockey with kids with names like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and whatever. But I was like the lower end of the scale as far as the wealth. I think my father absolutely had aspirations and a vision for his rise to that echelon of the community, of society, right? And his kids were part of it. So I grew up in that. My mother was a very close friend of a woman who married one of the Johnson and Johnson heirs. So I literally sort of had this opportunity to see that sort of scale of wealth as a child, and had a lot of great opportunities, right? So I think for a long part of my life, I felt very fortunate as an adoptee to have had access to, so many great experiences. And I still do have so many great experiences as a child. And in general, I think the childhood part of my childhood was really great. And I'd say at least until, high school or so, and even after, in the time, I never really thought about it as burdensome, right, or weird, because I was in it. So I had, what I'd call a good childhood. Was I supposed to stop at childhood, or was I gonna like I can't
Yeah,
remember
that's
what the
fine. Yeah, that's
yeah.
fine.
Yeah,
Um,
so that was pretty much it. Yeah.
so when did you find out you were adopted? Do you remember being told?
We always knew we were adopted. We had those books. I don't know, there's like three of them. There was like one for the kids, one for the parents, and I don't remember who the third one was for, but I know they sat in our bookshelf for forever. So I say I have an adopted brother who was also adopted. He's 2 years younger than me.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, we always knew, they always told us that that we were adopted. The story was that my birth mother, you know, loved us so much, but she, wasn't able to take care of us. Obviously it was like, started as a kid's story, right? And then I never had any real details. My parents never had any actual, biographical details or anything. So
Yeah.
I never learned any of that at the
Okay.
time.
So looking back, what were some of the most significant challenges that you faced growing up as an adoptee?
Yeah, so things sort of went off the rails in like sixth grade. So around 10 years old, I was going to a small private school in New Jersey. And that was the year that I've since as an adult been diagnosed with ADHD, and that was at least the year that those symptoms started to manifest. And so this was it was the late 70s was a very neurotypical time to be alive in general. It wasn't a place where people understood neurodivergence
Mhm.
or what ADHD was. And certainly in a very rigorous setting like that, it stood out, right? So they sort of tracked me very early on as having issues. I just wouldn't do work, or I would, yeah, yeah, it was mostly like opposition to doing the work, essentially,
Mhm.
or not getting it together to do the work. And so
So it was
so what
labeled more of a behavioral, just a acting out than.
yeah, it was acting out. What happened? So, what I know now is that my mother's friend, that one, the Johnson woman, we spoke a few months ago for the first time in a while, and she said that my mother always thought that because she had this document that my biological parents were intelligent and came from a background of smart people. And so she assumed that if I was smart, I'd be fine, right? And so like not only was it never identified as like an adoption issue because I was smart, right? And so what the issue was like, how smart was I and why wasn't I acting that smart, right? Or why wasn't I living up to my expectations,
Right.
which are words I never want to say to anyone, right?
Right.
So
Right.
and so that became the story. And in that time, right, like unbeknownst to me, a kid, that was my adopter father's, he's trying to enact his fantasy, right, of his a successful life in the country with his, high performing kids, and that was starting to slide. So, in my view at that time, it was family issues. A lot of kids' parents were getting divorced, right? So my family started going through divorce. My adopter father, went through depression that he never admitted to or did anything about, and then eventually there was a divorce. But through all of that, I was doing all these like programs and specialists and learning specialists put through, and I mean, like I was ambidextrous and they trained me to be right-handed. And like they used to do that to kids for,
Yeah.
whatever reason, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, seemed normal at the time, but looking back on it, it's like literal torture, it's like sitting there, tracing things with the wrong hand or the hand. Anyway,
Yeah.
so, so that was the experience of it. That's where it started anyway. Yeah. I
Okay.
know.
And I was reading another kind of blog that
Mhm.
you had written, and you said that you were named after one of your adoptive
Yeah.
parents' children that was had
Both of us
passed.
were. So my brother and I both got the names of some, they had tried. So the number I got from my mother's friend was she had had something like six miscarriages, and then she had a child that lived for a day and died,
Mm.
and then they adopted me, and then they got pregnant again after I was around, and they lost that baby. That was a stillbirth. And then they went and adopted my brother.
Wow.
So that was, and so I got the first child's name, but what they did was, it's just so messed up. What he did was, is he switched it. So I go by my middle name. That way, in the
Okay.
future, he could have actually given it as the first name to another son.
And how did that feel? I mean, it almost is like you were assigned a
Well, I
job.
didn't realize it. I mean, so this is detective stuff I figured out at
Okay.
age, at age 45, 50, right?
Okay.
Like, and it felt entirely in line with his character, if I'm being honest, right? Like, as I came to know him, I have so many stories about that man, but yeah, so that was, I didn't know at the time that they were his, his kid's sons, and he
Yeah.
passed away 2, 3 years ago, and irony of ironies, I ended up being the one that managed his end of life, and out of all of his loving family who didn't
Wow.
talk to him. So I got all the paperwork about his schemes and plans.
Oh, wow.
Anyway,
Interesting.
yeah.
So let's talk about identity a little bit. How has adoption affected your sense of identity and belonging?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. For me, it goes to this idea that um, you come into this world with a set of information, like a core set of stuff about yourself that defines, it's all you get, right? Coming in the door. And if you don't have, I can't remember the word they use, chain of custody, right? Or continuity of that information, in my brain, in my computer man brain, you don't know that you haven't been messed with. Like, you don't know that, like, the information, and it has been, right? You don't know that the
Right.
information that you have hasn't been changed, right, or
Mm-hmm.
wrong. And so that was not like a conscious thought. I think it was a driver of a disconnect throughout my life, as far as identifying with other people, my loved ones, myself, right? And so um, that, to me, is, there's two things that infuriate me about the patterns inherent in the adoption industry in the United States. One of them is the continuity of trauma, of maternal separation trauma. And the other one is this, and maybe it's a libertarian, I'm not a libertarian, but maybe it's a libertarian ideal, this, like, freedom, like, this, you have the right to, like, the right to life and liberty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your liberty is removed if your core information is just taken away from you. And that part pisses me off to no
Yeah.
end, right? And so the 1-2 punch for me is like the trauma punch, which I can work on, and sure, it'll never be gone. But, like, I know the tools, and I know how to process, and I know now how to sit with trauma. But I never stop smoldering about the whole change of identity thing.
Yeah.
And there's no need for it. You can't give me a reason other than, I mean, maybe you can, but I've never heard a reason other than some defining need for ownership, or, not ownership, but it's a justification of parent, not a helpfulness to a child to do that. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
harm to a child. So,
How do you think your identity changing, how did that affect you growing up
I mean,
or
I
even
think a
as an
lot of
adult?
it, yeah. So, I mean, the way that I experience now is the person that I am, having explored my actual heritage and life, and not even heritage, because, like, unfortunately, by the time I got a chance to be a detective about my lineage, I didn't give too much of a crap about it, right? But, like,
Mm.
the loop that was closed by understanding that person's a new person. I don't really, like, when I look at photos of myself maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't see the me that I am today, right? It was like, and so the way that I think it manifested in my life was, I had many shallow relationships. It was certainly tied into attachment issues and things like that. I mean, I got very good at playing identity, karaoke machine or whatever.
Yeah.
and that's certainly a tool that it was useful. So yeah,
Right.
but I didn't need to. So yeah.
Let's talk about your reunion a little bit if you're comfortable with that. You
Yeah, I'm fine
mentioned
with it.
you
I will say
mentioned
it's my
yeah, go
side
ahead.
of it.
Yeah, oh sure,
My birth mother has
definitely.
her side of it.
Yeah,
I don't think I will
definitely.
say anything that's untrue.
So that you mentioned that you are in reunion, but you're not speaking with your birth mother at the moment.
That's correct.
So tell
Yeah.
us what happened with your reunion and kind of
Yeah.
what
So I'll
where it
tell you
went
the story.
sideways.
I ended up finding my birth mother through Ancestry DNA. I had done it uh, right before the pandemic. No, maybe a year before the pandemic, and found my birth father, biological father, sorry, and he had passed by that point. I always say I found him, but he was dead. But that makes it sound like I found him like in the hall,
Mm.
but that's not what happened. And so I had met like that side of the family through Facebook, but I had no direct relatives on that side. And then the pandemic happened, so no one was going anywhere anyway. And then like a year later, towards the end of the pandemic, I got a notification that there was a new record uploaded, and I went in and looked, and I knew from having, done a bunch of it. Sorry, I'm using something clicky. Having done a bunch of detective work through the ancestry for my father, I knew that it was a close relative, either her or like her sister, brother, sister. And so through that connection, I found a cousin, and the cousin knew the story and knew my mother, and the cousin wouldn't tell me her name, but she said that she would confirm it if I told her who it
Oh,
was.
wow.
And so, I mean, I grabbed a tax record in like 10 minutes and was able to figure out who it was at that point. So I knew I got her name. I reached out over email. I found out from my cousin that I had sisters. So what I did was I reached out to my sisters first, to sort of I didn't know anything about my mother, right? So, and they were glad that I did, and sure. So, I emailed her. She was very happy, happy to hear from me. We reconnected. I'll be clear, like I went into this not needing a mother figure, right? My adoptive mother, who I ended up having a decent relationship in adulthood, she passed in 2007. I was good on the mother front, right? And so,
Hmm.
when I connected, it was like to find out information, and I didn't, but she really wanted to be a mother and be a grandmother. And, she told me that she regretted it all every day. And, she told me the stories over time. And so that was really nice. But unfortunately, what I knew that she didn't know I knew was that she had cut off that cousin from communication immediately after she told her. I connected with her and was angry at that cousin for
Oh, wow.
uploading the DNA that led me to her, right?
Wow.
Right? Kind of weird. And
Yeah.
like people have their lives, and I get it. Like she's in a New York suburb, bedroom community of New York City, right? In the Connecticut area of the world, and has a very put together life, and things have to fit into boxes, and I definitely don't fit into the box, the thin blue line
Yeah.
flag box that she has, in
Yeah.
any sense. And certainly my my queer daughter and my other adventurous child, my family's not the family that she raised around her, and that's
Mm.
fine.
Mm.
So I went on with it for a bit, but it was driving me crazy. Like I can't let something like that not resolve, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't work for me. And so at some point I went down there specifically and was like, what's up? What's the story with this? And she just, got mad, started talking about, the DNA being, compromised. It was sounding very Q-ian at the time. There's a lot of Q stuff going on. I don't know. It was tinged with, it was sounding like it was very inconvenienced. It was great. And like, I didn't want to be an inconvenience to her. I
Yeah.
didn't need anything from her, right? Like at that
Right.
point, I was working for Oracle. I was, doing just fine, career wise and money wise. I wasn't asking for anything. So yeah, that I just stopped after that. And I'm not, and I don't, I say I don't cut people out of my life lately, but I also don't have very many people in my life. But I certainly like, it's not, there's only been one other person in my life that I've done that, I had to do that with, and that's my ex-wife. Like
Yeah.
I don't take it easy that I just don't talk to someone. Oh, and I guess my father for lengths of time. But yeah, so that was the story. And we haven't talked
Yeah.
since. My sisters haven't reached out. Um, I talked to like one of them casually once about some health thing I was asking about. And I assume at some point, she'll die and I'll probably have a late adulthood relationship with my three sisters if they want or not, right? I don't know.
Yeah. Who knows?
But I had some really cool nieces and nephews that I would have loved to have gotten to know better. And I have two children under 6 that uh, were really, I mean, they don't remember it now, but they had a blast running around with their
Yeah.
cousins and stuff, so
Yeah. Yeah. It's too bad.
people are
Let's,
people.
yeah. Let's fast forward a little bit.
Sure.
When did you come out of the fog and what did that process look like for you?
Yeah. So I fast forward to rewind. So the scene was around 2010, 2011. I was living out in Portland, Oregon at the time. After my mother died in 2007, looking back, I blew everything up on the East Coast where I was and moved out to Oregon with my family to do a startup and facilitate a complete disconnect when I, divorced my wife out there. So they all came back here. And so I found myself out in on the West Coast, and I was dating a woman, and I had in my adult life this cycle, terrible cycle, relationship cycle, even in my marriage, right, alongside of it or whatever, of like, from the outside, I think it looked like the typical sort of, late 90s, middle-aged player dad guy, right? Very exciting and glamorous, right? But it's just essentially was me, breaking my own heart over and over again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of compulsively attaching to people and then either smothering that attachment or just, blowing it all up. And so I didn't want to keep doing that to people. And so this woman I was dating, I really, I liked a lot. And we went to a therapist, and the therapist, that was the first time I was in my, late 40s, mid 40s. And it's the first time anyone was like, yeah, adoptees, they have attachment issues sometimes. And I was like, well, duh, right? Like, what the shit? Like, yeah, of course. And so like, I mean, for me, right, at that moment, it was like just I literally by the end of that session, I no longer felt that way anymore at all. Like there was a part of me that just was like, you have been being just conned by this attack, this thing, like your entire and like, unfortunately that relationship didn't last pretty much for that reason. But the next one's been great. And so like so yeah, that was when I first sort of identified the first step out of the fog anyway, was like, this has done this to you. And so for a while I understood that. And I even understood like the pattern that created it, right? You get told over and over again that when someone really loves you, they leave or they give you away, right? And so
Mhm.
you start just sort of acting that pattern out unconsciously in your life, right? You make sure they really love you by just driving them absolutely crazy or doing things that make them leave.
Right.
Um, and then get to do it again. And so like I understood that had happened to me and I understood that it had done to me. But other than that, I hadn't really identified that like it didn't have to happen to me, right? Or that it didn't happen to happen the way that it did. Um, and so after that, over time, it sort of ebbed and flowed, but I'd have these periods where I'd be like, why the hell do I do this thing? And then I'd sort of drive down the road. Um, I'm not very good at at end to end, long term learning of things, I guess would be the way. I'm not good at that. What I am good is like drilling into something and understanding it. And then once I started reading papers on like maternal separation trauma and realized that it wasn't even adoptees, it's a pattern that exists outside of adoption. Adoptees just are in it.
Yeah.
And that it's so much bigger than that, right? And so one of the things that makes me so angry about the industry is the industry minimizes that incredibly, right? And what they try to do is they try to say, well, look, it doesn't happen to adoptees. They try to make it a statistic that's an adoptee statistic, and it's not. You can't swap out a parent and call it the same statistic. You're not giving a parent a maternal connection by just giving them an adopted parent. So yeah, so as I started to understand that, like I think it had to go somewhere. Like I couldn't just keep being fine about it. And right around the time when my adopted father passed, I got a call one night. He had fallen in his apartment, and I had just been really gone through. I think I just stepped completely out of the fire. I was angry, I was ready, and I was going to talk to him about this. And I put all the pieces together. And so that was 2000. I mean, that was end of 21. I'd say I was like fully out. So I went down to New York, went into his hospital room, and he had Alzheimer's. He was completely unable to process anything that I had to say to him. So I sat with him for the next 8 days, like listening to him talk about going to hockey camp and shit and pretending like I was 13 years old.
Yeah.
Until he passed. But that, yeah, by the time, it's been 4 years. I say 4 or 5 years since adoption's not great. It's been 2, 3 years since I've been talking about it, trying to like wave a flag in the air for people.
Yeah.
Adoptee trauma is real, and you deserve healing. Somatic Mindful Guided Imagery can help you navigate these complex emotions and find peace. Reclaim your story and embrace your journey. Visit somatichealingjourneys.com today and start your path to healing and wholeness.
So let's talk about that a little bit. You are a big advocate for adoption being abolished altogether. Can you explain why you believe that?
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's a nuanced thing, right? When I say I want adoption abolished, we can look at examples in other lands, other countries, of things I'd be happy to accept if we wanted to do that and still call it adoption. The core reason, the reason that I would think adoption needs to be abolished is that in the story of an adoptee's life, if the story of an adoptee's life was a Big Mac, the adoption would be a sesame seed on that Big Mac, as far as like the size of the thing that it is, right? It's a document, it's paperwork. And it's legal paperwork that's just incredibly harmful. And so like when I say we want to abolish adoption, that's what I don't want the sesame seed on and not all. I'm fine with like 98% of the sesame seeds. I just don't want that one sesame seed, right? And people lose their minds, right? Because they think that what we're saying is you can't have a child in your home, right? And believe me, I want less children going to homes that aren't their parents, if at all possible. But I'm not saying that you can't do that when you abolish adoption. But the real reason is that the word itself is, when you adopt something, you take it and you make it your own. And that fundamentally is not what you should do to another human being. So like, I get that we can call it adoption, right? And still have it be a better adoption. But like, I don't know if you take away the part where we're disconnecting a child from their identity, like that's the adoption. What are you going to call it? You don't have to call the lawyers to do that thing anymore, because it's not like, it's a different thing, right? It's caregiving. So like, why can't we call it caregiving or mentoring? And the truth is that, and I'm I'm generalizing, right? I'm speaking for myself, but I know I'm speaking for at least a few other people when I say that a child who's been through maternal separation trauma, they no longer need just like a parent. I would have been much happier looking back on my life, having had caregivers who understood what I'd been through, could look for the downstream manifestations of that trauma and guide me through it, right? And be very, and for me personally, right, I'm big about agency and my agency, right? So like, I feel like every parent has to do this, whether you have adopted kids or not, right? Your job is to not make decisions on their behalf that like don't, that they can't consent to, that are significant, at least without keeping the record so they can try to undo them when they're older, right? And so I feel like the person who raises a child who's been through maternal separation trauma needs to understand that.
Yeah.
And so I only remember the question, but I'm on my soapbox now. So I can tell, I'll just taper off. I don't know where I was going with that, but like, they need a caregiver, right? And it's not an adoption at that point. And like, we can still have adoptions. You can do it when you're 18. You can do it. I mean, I'd question why you want to do it, but like, the problem right now is that this concept of adoption has been built up by society and the media. It's something that no one really knows what is happening, right? Everyone's learned about adoption from the Despicable Me franchise, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not how any of it works. And it's not the like, when you see like an ape adopting another ape and it's amazing and cute, that's not it either, right? Like no paperwork's involved there. So like, yeah, it's gotta go.
So
that's why abolish it. Yeah.
Yeah. So are you kind of advocating guardianship then, or?
Yeah. So, I mean, and I've had a lot of conversations with mutuals about this, and unfortunately, what I want to see happen is I want the current domestic private adoption industry just can go completely. We don't need that. It's a terrible pattern. It monetizes children in service of family building. I mean, if you look at the reasons that people acquire children, only 2% of them do it out of the goodness of their hearts, and that's like self-reporting. But so guardianship is the mechanism, and then when they can consent to adoption, that's fine. I think unfortunately you still need the private legal part for a while, because otherwise you're putting it all in the hands of social services, and they have a lot of stuff to untangle as well. So it's like adoption has a first mile problem, whether that first mile is infants or foster kids. And so that there needs to be sort of oversight, the way that they've done it in other countries like Australia and Denmark, I think is the one. I always mix up Denmark and the Netherlands, but I think it's Denmark. But the way that they've done it is they've kept the private adoption patterns, but with oversight from the state and strict requirements for who's allowed to request to adopt who. And so like in Australia, where they had 200 adoptions last year, like if we can get to 200, we don't have to have 200. I did the math. It would be 2,600 for us. If we could get to 2,600 adoptions a year, we can call it adoption, and I'll be done. But the way that they did it was it's private adoption patterns, oversight by the state, and it's trauma informed. And that's a thing like in the US, we don't even really admit to the trauma. Like we give it sort of a hand wave. Yeah, there's some trauma, just love them up. And like, I don't mean to say that, right? There are absolutely adoption agencies, I'm sure, who try. I don't know that I'm sure of any of that, but
I haven't heard any.
I don't know. I'm giving them way too much credit. The bar is very low.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you come across adoptees? You're on TikTok. Do you come across adoptees that agree with you, or do you get a lot of pushback, even from just society, the public?
So I am one of the people who will dive into a battle or a discussion with a fogged adoptee. I try to be respectful. So here's my thing. The reason that I speak other than the, this secret internal feel good, feel good reason to me that I don't talk about, is that, like, I had a suicide attempt. Are we allowed to say suicide on this show?
Yeah.
I had a suicide attempt because of being unable to escape feelings and behaviors directly caused by the trauma, from my maternal separation trauma and my adoption. And so if I can help one person, either now or in the future, right? Like, they don't even have to agree with me now. In 10 years, because the problem with maternal separation trauma is it doesn't just happen when you're like under the umbrella of your adopters. It happens later, and it's not connected to anything. Like, I was doing this startup, and I was like, executing and doing, for someone who had dropped out of high school, I was doing fantastic, right? And I was just miserable and anxious and couldn't figure anything out, right? And so, like, if I can save someone from that in 10 years, that's great. So that's like my first thing. I mean, I love kids. I have four. I call what I do child welfare. But I mean, they can be kind of little dicks too. Like, I'm not a great, it's like people think I just love kids. It's not that at all. But like, they're humans and they deserve human rights. And like, mine got taken away, so maybe I'm pissed about it. But like, so that's, I guess, round two. And then round three, like, if I can educate a foggy adoptee and change a mind or two, and you do, it's a game of inches, right? And I don't, but you get DMs from people whose mind you change, or you see people who stick around and then start, responding differently. Like, everyone comes into it with such shock because, again, despicable me. No one knows what adoption is, right? And everyone thinks that they're just children in dumpsters, rolling down the street, needing people to save them. So
Yeah.
you can't blame them for coming into it like that. And adoptees, right? There's no room in our experience for there to be something wrong with it. At least there wasn't, for a long time. I think maybe people admit it now. I don't know. From what I see on Reddit, it's still pretty thick. But
Yeah. So the suicide attempt, you were younger then, and you probably didn't correlate that to adoption at all at the time, I'm assuming.
isn't that crazy? Like, I went through a hospitalization, basically. And like, I was at therapy, like these programs that I did as a kid, they included therapy. So I had been in and out of therapy my entire adult life. There had been no shortage of professionals and behavioral professionals. And then, yeah, I adopted a meditation practice. I did rigorous CBT, even though we've debunked all that now and no one uses it anymore. I did a bunch of work there, and no one ever connected. I mean, and I didn't either, right? And like, on paper, I'm a very smart person. I should have been able to figure this out, right? And that's the insidious, weird part about it, is like, I can like figure out virtually anything else, and it was like, it was smacking me in the head, and I wasn't getting it.
Mm,
So yeah, if I can do that to another person, like start that train, great. It's there's a Seinfeld, and that I think it's Seinfeld, where you don't tip over a vending machine all at once. You got to rock it back and forth a few times,
Yeah. Right. So you talk about putting the child first quite a bit. Can you define kind of in a nutshell what that would look like?
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is outside of adoption. Again, this is like a parenting thing, and you can apply the same pattern to adoption. Adopted child is, I think our role as parents essentially is to prove to our children that bringing them into this experience wasn't a terrible idea, because we've literally done it to them without their consent, right? And a lot of us do it to fulfill a role that we believe we are destined to, simply for existing on Earth, right? And it's not the responsibility of any child to make that role work, right? Like, that's not a child's job. They don't know how to do that job. And so I think what our caregiver role is, our parenting role is to, in addition to, teaching them and all the things that are amazing about being a parent, is to sort of protect them in the decisions that we make on their behalf until they're old enough to understand those decisions themselves. And a good one is circumcision, right? Like, we have one of my sons had a condition where we had to circumcise him because of I can't. A lot of kids get it. I can't remember the name of it, right? And then we have another son who's uncircumcised, and so I didn't like the idea. I mean, we did it for a medical reason, but I didn't like the idea of doing something like if it's something that the child wants, like he can do it down the road, no one's stopping you, but like you don't like mess with that. So I don't even remember the specific. It's a very easy formula, I guess, is what I'm saying about putting the child first. It simply is, protect their agency. In addition to I'm not going to tell anyone how to the job of being a parent. I'm probably not the best at it. I get through, but I have a lot of help also. So, but yeah, I think that they're little humans. We treat them like they are, the royal we treat them often as their accessories or their things that say stuff to us. One thing I've seen the last couple of days, I saw Elon Musk talking about how his child was taken from him. His son was taken from him because they transitioned, and when he signed the paperwork, he lost his son. And then I also saw a mother of a trans child talking about how when she talked about remembering them as their past self, it was harmful. It's 2 videos. And it's this same pattern. It's this idea that our children define a part of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some expectation on them being a thing so that we can be the thing. And I guess maybe I'm fortunate that I have no idea how to be the thing or what imagining to be the thing would look like. So I don't feel that. But it's like at every decision tree, you just say to yourself, am I doing this because it's for them, or am I doing it because, I want to talk about it on Facebook to all the other, moms and, or I don't know, like I'm not bagging on moms, dads, we do it too, but like, I don't do it, but people do it. Are we defining ourselves with our children, or are we helping them to be human beings in the world? Right. Because, whatever your belief is, like from birth to the end, this is where your playground. So you should learn how to play in it, I guess.
Yeah, I think
and feel trust in the people that are giving it to you,
Yeah.
and that they're doing it for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Letting your kids be individuals and letting them have that autonomy as much as possible.
Pretty much. And it's not, and look, like no one's great at it all the time. Like a lot of times I think people think that like I've never done things. Like I have 2 adult daughters who I have had many long conversations with about the trauma that I unintentionally inflicted into their lives growing up. And I think a lot of times when I'm talking to adopted parents, or, I come across as blunt or rude, and like, it's that I'm saying that these things don't happen to me. Like I've never done what they're doing, but I've done all kinds of my own shitty things to my children, and I need to be responsible for those things.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I'm fortunate that I have an opportunity to do it again. But at the same time, like I look at my children now and I still have to text my daughters and be like, hey, I'm sorry that was like, fuck this up so bad,
Yeah,
so.
That's good though. What message would you convey to adoptive parents that might be thinking about, or potential adoptive parents that are considering adoption?
So, I mean, I think that what I say is maternal separation is trauma. And when you commodify a child by using a tool like adoption to acquire them, which erases their identity, is essentially, it's an industry that is delivering a product to a market. You compound that trauma potentially. So, I mean, these are all, the trauma is real. The manifestations are potential. The outcomes are potential. But the potentials are high and terrible, and no one really seems to think about that. And part of the reason that you don't find large cohorts of unhappy adult adoptees is because they don't exist, right? They end their lives. If you look at the data for maternal separation trauma, adoptive people who go through maternal separation trauma contemplate suicide 4 times more than people who don't. There's different studies that say 6, there's some that say 2. But 4 is pretty consistent. And people don't really think about what that means. But if you look at statistics, like during the pandemic, 12% of kids between the ages of 14 and 24 contemplated suicide.
Mm-hmm.
But what that means is that in that same age range, the adoptees, I mean, sure, there's variances. It's not a 1-to-1, right? But that means 52% of those kids contemplated suicide. 52% of a population considering taking their life sounds just terrible to me. And if I'm wrong and it's only 35% of a population, right? It's still just horrible. Like, and they're young, right? And the problem is that there's that age band where it happens, and it still keeps happening, right? But it's, you know, sure, then it does go down to 30% or whatever. But in the end, there's fewer adoptees to ask the questions to.
Yeah. I think the statistics are higher because how many times does anyone even ask that question when somebody unalives themselves? They don't ask that question usually. So in closing, what would you like struggling adoptees to know?
I mean, I don't want to say that you can feel great, but you can feel better. I mean, you absolutely can change. Like for me, what I'll say is you hear things, people say stuff like, oh, cheaters never change, people don't change. I'm literally a different person, and I don't feel like I'm not paying lip service to say that, like, I'm not that person anymore. Like, I don't feel the way that I felt. I didn't feel, and that was such a horrible feeling, right? To be that person all the time. It's on some level. So you identifying these patterns and processing them can help them go away. I know I don't, the other thing that I talk about a lot is substance use. I have a substance use disorder. Sobriety never worked for me, but I can tell you that working on my trauma now, like I drink the way that I never could imagine people drinking before, right? Like my parents and their friends who would have like a beer on a weekend if they wanted one, right? And like the cans would sit in the fridge otherwise. Like that's now my fridge, and it's like amazing feeling, you know, because like it wasn't that I was powerless to these substances. It was that I was like self-medicating this hurt that I didn't really even know where it came from or that it existed, right?
Yeah.
But when you identify it and you help it, it feels better. So like, and that's the thing, people, you know, when it comes down to it, I do a lot of statistics. I'm very comfortable that like things that I say are true. But when I work on the problems that were caused by the patterns of my origins and that life, the symptoms go away. So, you know, it's a 1-to-1 ratio there.
Okay. So where can people find you if they want to start following you? And
yeah, so for now I'm on TikTok. Yusufus Mandelbrot is my internet nickname, or Yusufus, which is hard to spell, but I'm sure you'll probably write it down somewhere.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Most people write mucus, something like that.
We will have that in the show notes so people can find you.
Awesome. Yeah, but also like anyone, just I'm happy to answer questions. People message me all the time. And yeah, this has been great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Brad. And like I said, I don't get anyone talking about that subject. And so I got educated a little bit today too. And I know there's other people out there that, you know, share the same views and things. So thanks for coming on.
I have a thing that
today.
I say to my wife all the time. If there was a good way to interpret a thing I said or a horrible way to interpret a thing I said, go with that I intended the good way and check in with me. So if any of your listeners, there's not a big filter between my brain and my mouth. So, you know, but generally I mean well.
Well, this is what I say at the end of every show. So here we go.
All right.
Thanks for listening, Karma Crew. And as always, take what you need and leave what you don't. And always remember to mind your own karma. And I'll see you next time.
This podcast is created for educational purposes by the telling of adoption experiences. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or Mind Your Own Karma.